Hello and welcome to the Kyiv Post podcast with me, Ricky Rahimtula. In this week's episode, we bring you the highlights from the July 22nd print edition of the Kyiv Post. We'll discuss a Ukrainian social network which is turning time into money, and we'll find out about Ukrainians trying to get compensation for damage to their homes during the war in the Donbas. But first, we turn to a story from our Journalism of Tolerance series on orphans and children being cared for by the state. There are around 100,000 children in Ukraine today who are living in care, according to Open Democracy, and that number is growing. The statistics of what happens to children when they leave from these institutions are not terribly encouraging. Very few go on to university. 20% end up in prison, and generally many find it difficult to make the transition into adulthood. But an initiative known as My Friend is trying to improve the situation by matching orphan children in Ukraine with adults who can act as mentors and offer support. Staff writer Toma Istomina has been looking into this for us, and she joins me now. Toma, tell us a bit more about the program. Why was it started and what is it trying to achieve?
So basically, a couple of volunteers who has visited orphanages around Ukraine for a while, at some point they realized that what they're doing is not enough, because they brought food, they brought some clothes and stuff that children need, they organized some events for them, but they realized that these children, they really lack care, love, and attention. So they decided that such program would be helpful because they would have their personal adult who would really care about them and who would listen to them and who would help them to overcome some fears maybe and difficulties.
You take one case. There's one young orphan named Anastasia. She has a 30-year-old business consultant named Maria, who she's been partnered with as part of the program. And what did you see there in terms of what benefits the relationship had, both for the child, Anastasia, and for Maria as well?
So Maria, the volunteer, she decided that she doesn't want to compete with the girl's parents and family, because she believes that all kids, no matter if they live with their families or they live in orphanages, they love their parents. So she decided she wants to help Anastasia, this young girl, to improve her relationship with her mother. And that's why she meets them when they're together. She visits them when Anastasia's mother takes her home for weekends or holidays. What she does, she basically just talks to them and tries to explain them some things that they can't realize by themselves. And Anastasia, this 12-year-old girl, she told me that they actually realized some things, both her and her mother, due to Maria, the volunteer. And now her mother quit drinking. She takes her daughter home every weekend, and she actually plans to take her back home, and she wants Anastasia to go to the local school and live just a normal life.
That's generally quite a positive story there to come out of this. In the wider sense of orphanages and children living in care in Ukraine, from the statistics that I mentioned at the beginning, we see that it's quite a difficult transition for many children when they leave those institutions and come into adult life. And this My Friend initiative obviously is trying to help them to make that transition more smoothly. What was your feeling overall? Is this the kind of thing which Ukraine needs more of, to try to help these children in care and orphans to lead normal adult lives?
Well, the case that I wrote about is more like an exception, but it's a positive story. These exceptions, they exist, and maybe we should try to increase them. But in general, children who live in orphanages, they have problems with communication. They live in this small society. They're scared of everything. They have many fears. I think that the system itself is a little bit absurd, because some families are really dysfunctional. You can't help but take this kid and try to raise it outside of the family. But some parents, they have difficult situations in their life. For example, they can live in small villages where there's nothing to do, there's no work, and they can't live a normal life. They're poor, and they have to let their kids live in orphanages. So in these cases, the system has to, I think, try to connect children and parents back, try to help them with maybe some financial problems, maybe with some psychological things, to try to explain them something. But taking a kid from parents doesn't help mostly. And very often these kids who grow up in orphanages, eventually they end up being poor, drinking, and then letting their own kids live in orphanages again. So it's a story that happens again and again.
Yeah, the wider system then, of course, still failing in many in some ways, but at least the My Friend initiative is trying to do what it can to solve those issues. But Toma, that's where we'll have to leave it today. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Toma Istomina on the My Friend initiative. We turn now to the business section, where this week we have technology correspondent Denis Krasnikov looking into Nimsys. The Ukrainian company has created a social media smartphone app which gives users the chance to accumulate digital currency by spending time online. Denis, this sounds almost too easy. All I have to do is spend time on this social media app and I could get rich.
Well, yes, you can get rich, but it also depends on the future of the startup. Because if it's popular, more people will use it, more vendors will accept Nimsys as payment, and then it may become pricier. And hence, if more vendors, for example, accept Nimsys as payment for, say, clothes or any other goods, you'll be able to buy these goods. At the moment, only few stores do that, and a few things are available for you for Nimsys.
That's right. I mean, that's what you write in the piece, that you say the Nimsys are being accepted in Kyiv anyway, at some cafes, some coffee bars. The value of it, though, seems to fluctuate quite wildly. You can get pizza for 4,000 Nimsys, but falafel, meanwhile, is 10,000. Coffee can be 5,000. So how do we really know what this Nimsys is actually worth?
Well, we don't. That's, there are only few vendors that accept Nimsys as payment, and so that's why they are to set prices as they want. The founders claimed the price of 1,000 Nimsys is $1, but nobody has to follow the official price, because it's like an investment right now, and the vendors, they take a risk and they accept it as payment, but at the same time they don't have to. We should keep in mind that this is a fictional virtual money that doesn't have anything, any connection with the real world. But at the same time, as it happened with bitcoins, for example, bitcoins in 2010 they costed 8 cents, but now people believe in this currency, they use it a lot, they try to get it, and that's why the price fluctuated to $2,700 per one Bitcoin.
And I wanted to ask you about that, because digital currencies in general are becoming more and more recognized, Bitcoin obviously being the leading example. And so what do you think are the prospects for Nimsys? 2 million users already in the former Soviet Union. Is this going to go global? Do you think it's going to catch on?
Well, it may, but it will depend on the other countries in which Nimsys will operate. Now, the application is available only in former Soviet Union countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Azerbaijan. But it's now working on rollout in the United States, in the European Union. We'll see, because now it seems like people in the States have so many cryptocurrencies they can use, and it will depend on many factors. The company tries to adapt the application for other markets. If they succeed, probably there will be more users, there will be more vendors, the currency will become more popular, the value of it will increase. The company is also working on their own shop, which is called Nimsys Goods, and they are going to sell different stuff there, like from clothes to coffee and food, and if they succeed in this as well, you'll be able to spend your Nimsys. Probably the real value of it will hold.
Well, Denis, it sounds like it may not quite be a get-rich-quick scheme just yet, but there is hope for the future. But for now, that's where we'll leave it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That was Denis Krasnikov on social networking app Nimsys. And finally, on today's programme, we look at the question of compensation for those whose property has been damaged as a result of the war in eastern Ukraine. Staff writer Josh Kowensky has been to the Donbas to investigate. Safely back in Kyiv, he joins me now. Josh, the biggest issue here seems to be that although in law Ukrainians do have a right to compensation, in fact, even when they've had court rulings in their favour, that compensation hasn't been paid. So what's behind this?
That's correct. Ukrainians do have a right to compensation both under Ukrainian law and under the European Convention on Human Rights, to which Ukraine is a signatory. Under the European Convention, states must guarantee protection of property to their citizens. Ukraine, therefore, in time of war, must compensate its citizens for destroyed property. Under Ukrainian law, I think it's worth noting here that Ukraine passed laws in summer 2014 regarding the war, which designated the war as an anti-terrorist operation. Under Ukrainian terrorism law, the government has to compensate its citizens if they lose their property in the event of a terrorist attack. So since what's happening in Donbas is technically not a war, it's terrorism under Ukrainian law, every time somebody's house is damaged due to a shelling, it's because of a terrorist attack. So the government has to compensate its citizens in that case. As you correctly noted, the issue isn't so much the laws on the books, but rather that the government itself is not following its own law. That these citizens, a lot of whom are either very poor or very old or both, they lose their housing because of shelling, and that's all they have, and the government refuses to compensate its own citizens for their damaged property. A number of organizations are suing the government on behalf of these citizens, and even in those cases, the government is having a difficult time finding the procedure under Ukrainian law to pay them out. Right now, what they're doing is this sort of makeshift method. It's very much like kind of tape and glue, by which they effectively exchange the deed of the property, of the destroyed property. The citizen who owns the destroyed property gives the deed to the government, and then the government gives the citizen a sum of money. So they're effectively selling the damaged property to the government, although it's more of an exchange, it's not necessarily a sale.
And do you think, you're right, that there's a possibility that some of the lawyers, the activists, they're thinking of going to the European Court of Human Rights with these cases? Do you think that is a likely scenario, and will it work?
It's definitely likely. There are some groups, there are multiple groups doing this. There's the group I profiled, which is Right to Protection, but there's also USAID funds a group called the Helsinki Group on Human Rights, and then there's another law firm, ILF, that's kind of doing it pro bono on their own. And they're all, for them, the real brass ring in all of this is the European Court of Human Rights and getting a ruling there. So it's not a question of whether they'll go there, it's a question of who basically gets a positive decision first. There are, thousands of people in the Donbas have had their homes destroyed and almost none of compensation, so it's a hot issue. There's a lot of cases to be litigated on it. Whether or not it's going to be enforced, that's a different question. The European Court of Human Rights can enforce decisions in Ukraine insofar as Ukraine is signatory. I think they can impose certain sanctions on Ukraine, but it's tough. As long as the money is not written in the Ukrainian budget, it's very difficult for the Ukrainian government to actually make any payouts to people. One option people were discussing is that at the end of the day, it's Russian supplied, or Russian troops actually, who are causing the damage here. So one thing that Ukraine could do is sue Russia International Arbitration Court, win damages, and then use that money to pay off people the compensation. But that process would take years and years.
Like you say, that years and years. So obviously looking at a very long time frame on this issue, and like you say, thousands of people are affected by it, and in fact that number is growing because the war continues. And so it strikes me that even if the fighting does end, this is going to be a problem which is going to be long-standing, and it's going to be something that Ukraine is eventually, one way or the other, going to have to deal with.
It is, in any case, because regardless of the outcome of the war, if and when it ends, either with Ukraine retaking the lost territories in the Donbas, or if it just kind of stabilizes along the current lines, Ukraine at some point is going to have obligation to rebuild the destroyed cities and towns that it still controls. The other point there is that there's a 3-year statute of limitation on Ukrainian law for getting the compensation. So right now, if you think about the war as having begun in 2014, the first people whose homes are destroyed, if they haven't filed their cases by now, essentially, they're totally forfeited their opportunity to get compensation. So if you think about this issue, from the moment the war ends, the last people whose homes were damaged or destroyed will have 3 years from that point to get the compensation. So for them, for these poor people who really can't rely on their own representation because the government services don't extend to the actual contact line, they extend maybe 10, 15 miles before that. These people have to rely on these international organizations to get legal help. And to get legal representation before the government to do this. So for them, this is really their only shot at getting compensation that they deserve under Ukrainian and international law. And again, for a lot of people, that's very difficult. There was one woman we spoke to who her house had been bombed twice, and I think it takes around 8 months to get the paperwork done, and she was just starting the process a year after the second bombing of her house, after the second instance of damage. So you think about it, that's already a year and 8 months before they can even get enough paperwork to file the case in court. So that's 2 years down. So again, the statute of limitations only works from the moment you file a case, but still, 2 years is a lot of time.
It sounds like one fears that there could be a lot of people who are going to be left without compensation for their homes and who are going to have to find ways just to pick up the pieces. But we hope that won't be the case. we'll have to wait and see, Josh, but thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Josh Kavinsky there on compensation for property damage in the Donbas. And on that note, that's where we'll have to wrap things up this week. Remember, if you want to read any of the stories we've been discussing, you can do so at our website, kyivpost.com. Until next week, from me and my producer, Anna Yakutenko, goodbye.